Welcome back to class, everyone. Pull up your chairs. Great to see you once again. Hope that you had, or that you were able to use your catch-up day, not your mustard day, but your catch-up day to catch up on your work. And I saw some of you in the comments were kind of roasting me for my cool joke saying that it was a real bruh moment. You seem to really be relishing in insulting me there. You know, get it? Because like relish. Okay, well, let us turn up the beat here as we move on. I am, I'm full of them today, folks. Okay, but anyway, we're moving on now, and we're going underground. We're going to talk about some of the fringe movements in rock and roll during the 1970s. We're going to start a little bit in the late 60s as this stuff was getting started to see where it all comes from, but um, this is the non-mainstream stuff that was going on, okay? And remember what I said about opposites early on? This is music, this fringe movement, this underground movement of rock and roll in the 1970s is a reaction, right? There's some major movements in music and I guess also you could say in art, in architecture, in even in politics, in philosophy, and all sorts of different fields that rise up in reaction to a larger movement, right? So if there's like a kind of dominant ideology, or in our case, a dominant form of music, then what you often get is you'll get groups of people who are in rebellion to that. Okay, and that's what we're going to see here with the punk rock movement that gets started in the 1970s. And we'll just start off here. Okay, during the 1970s, music calmed down. No longer was it and what I mean by calm down is that it was not full of the kind of drug-laced and anti-war um, type of music that really defined it in the 1960s. Okay, there's a lot of music about feelings and personal strife, and a lot of it was like these big arena shows and things like that. But punk rock is the exact opposite of that. In fact, if you strip it down to its bare elements, punk rock is 3 or 4 basic chords, some easy to remember lyrics, and a rebellious attitude toward social norms, but really towards authority. I think it's fair to say that at its very essence, punk rock as an attitude is anti-authoritarian. Um, this is why you see a lot of anarchic imagery, right? You see the anarchy symbol a lot of times here. Um, these tend to be against centralized authority. But musically speaking, it's basically, they're very simple songs, but it's really because of the attitude behind it that makes it so powerful, that make these simple songs so powerful. Okay, now technically speaking, punk rock started in the mid 1970s um, in the US. Now I'll get some pushback from some people who may be well initiated into the punk rock world here, because there's kind of a rivalry between the US and the UK as to who invented punk. Um, The people who are correct say that it started in New York City in the mid 1970s with the Ramones, and people in the UK say, "Oi, it's Tuesday, isn't it?" And they also say, and they also say that it started in London with a band called The Clash. And those are the two bands that we're really going to focus our punk rock lesson on. But um, let's talk about kind of the proto-punks, the people who came before uh, punk rock was really fleshed out and kind of exemplified the attitude of punk early on. Um, we're going to talk about a group from the 1960s called the Velvet Underground, and we'll also talk about a gentleman named Iggy Pop and his band, The Stooges. All right, so let's start with Iggy. There he is. He was born James Newell Osterberg Jr. on April 21st, 1947 in Muskegon, Michigan. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was known for his wild and spastic onstage performances, and when you watch the video here of Iggy Pop, I think you'll see what I mean. I think spastic is really the best way to describe his kind of dance moves on stage. But you know, this is that rebellious attitude, and he's, you'll see here, he's a very kind of wild guy. Would sometimes be perform shirtless, sometimes would perform in like a woman's blouse, sometimes would, be in a tank top. But it's, a very rebellious, anti-societal norm type of performer here. He's considered by many to be one of the innovators of punk, who really kind of exemplified this punk rock attitude before the movement kind of officially got underway. And after his punk rock career, he had a career as an actor. He was in movies like Sid and Nancy, The Color of Money, Hardware, The Crow, the Rugrats movie, believe it or not, Snow Day, Coffee and Cigarettes, Somewhere in California, Crybaby, and Dead Man. He also, if you are initiated into the 90s Nickelodeon TV show, pantheon of television shows that I grew up watching, one of my favorite shows is The Adventures of Pete and Pete, about two brothers, both named Pete. And Iggy Pop plays the father of one of Little Pete's friends named Nona Mecklenburg, so he is Mr. Mecklenburg from Pete and Pete as well. All right, let's talk about the Velvet Underground with Lou Reed. This is them in 1966. So if you think about it, what's going on in 1966? This is like right in the midst of the British invasion. This is a year before Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band comes out. So this, they are, very early pioneers in this new style of music. They were formed in the mid-60s by Lou Reed. And I should update this slide because Lou Reed has passed away. Just not long ago, but he is sadly no longer with us. His main collaborator was John Cale. They were managed, actually, believe it or not, by the famous pop artist Andy Warhol. So, yeah, a lot of people don't know that about Lou Reed. So this is part of the whole New York City underground scene. in the 60s, mid to late 60s, and going into the 70s. Andy Warhol, if you're not familiar, very well known artist. You can see many of his work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Well, you used to be able to go see it. Now, who knows? I'm sure maybe you could take a virtual tour. He would do things like have the picture of the Campbell's soup can. What else are some of his favorite? The kind of the four-panel picture of Marilyn Monroe that has different colors on it. He was a pop artist in the same vein as what's that guy's name, Roy Lichtenstein. I'm not really a art historian, so I apologize if I'm not getting that stuff correct, but very well known. And he actually managed the Velvet Underground for during their existence. So it just goes to show they were very tapped into this new artistic movement going on in the Village in New York City, and the downtown, what was colloquially called the downtown scene during the 60s and 70s, and even into the 80s, I guess you could say. Their mix of melody and feedback was similar to Syd Barrett, if you remember from Pink Floyd, but they had a kind of almost like I don't necessarily want to compare them to Bob Dylan, but they were also known for their very kind of poetic and abstract lyrics. So some of their songs include I'm Waiting for the Man, The Gift, Pale Blue Eyes, and Stephanie Says. John Cale left the band in 1968, and then the band broke up in 1970. And then Lou Reed would later go on to have a very successful solo career with Transformer, an album that came out in 1972, Rock and Roll Animal in 1974, the Metal Machine Music in 1975, and especially in this last album here, Metal Machine Music, this is a very abstract and experimental, very avant-garde album here, okay? During this time, this is like, if you're looking into the world of classical music during this time, the 60s and 70s were a period of great experimentation, and there was the minimalist movement in classical music that was being forged by composers like Steve Reich and Philip Glass, and that type of experimentation that was going on in the classical world was influencing music outside of the classical world as well, including Lou Reed. All right, so let's talk about CBGBs. This sadly is no longer around. It was kind of a big deal a few years ago when it closed down, because this was really the center of punk rock in its early days, and then through the 80s and 90s as well. This is where bands who were outside of the mainstream would get booked. These bands eventually became the backbone of the anti-government, anti-establishment movement that punk rock lays its laurels on. Okay, so this is where you would get a lot of punk rockers. You would get a lot of these like Lou Reed experimental types. You would get all of these various different, I guess we could call them sub-genres of punk rock, or punk rock adjacent, I guess we could say. So you get like new wave bands like Blondie and the Talking Heads. You get pure punk bands like the Ramones, Patti Smith, Television. Okay, so yeah, so let's get into talking about the Ramones, because the Ramones really were in many ways, the first punk band. All right, so the Ramones hailed from Queens, New York. Many of their songs are about growing up in New York City. So, who are the members of the Ramones? Well, we have Dee Dee Ramone, Joey Ramone, Johnny Ramone, and Tommy Ramone. Guess what? They're not all related. It's a gimmick. It's a gimmick, but it was it did what gimmicks were supposed to do, and it helped them get some notoriety. Okay, so I'm gonna list a couple of Ramones songs for you there. I'm gonna give you Rock and Roll High School and Sheena is a Punk Rocker. Maybe I'll even give you Blitzkrieg Bop. These were songs, these songs may be familiar to you, but remember what we said punk was. 3 or 4 chords, very repetitive, very easy to remember lyrics. And, these are people, this is like, whereas like prog rock, remember we talked about prog rock and we said that, that's something where you really need formal training on your instrument. A lot of these guys came from the world of classical music and jazz. Punk rock is like the opposite. Punk rock is a type of music where people who have never played the instrument before in their life can go on stage and and crank some songs out because it's simple chord structure, simple lyrics, and what's always been true about punk is that it's way more about the attitude than it is about the music. The music is part of the whole aesthetic, but there's the fashion about it, and most importantly, there's the anti-authoritarian, um, rebel without a cause foundation that it's all based on. So, there's the fashion component to it, and there's the music component to it, but these are all just components, right? They are not as important as just like the pure attitude. So this is the album cover of their debut album. It came out in 1976. People love their wild, energetic music, black leather jackets, Beatles-style bangs, and self-deprecating humor. The songwriting formula, we just kind of talked about this, is a sweet, catchy melody sung over a simple 3-chord progression. And here's the other part about punk rock that we haven't really mentioned, played as loudly and as fast as possible. Okay, that is the essence of punk rock right there. So we talked about Sheena as a punk rocker. I wanna be sedated is another good one. Okay, so let's talk about punk rock in the UK. The UK also had their own punk rock movement. As I said before, the people in the UK will claim that they started punk. In fact, it became an influence on some of the original punk rock founders here in America. They would incorporate some of the UK style punk into their own music. UK punk rockers had a different idea about anti-government because they were anti-monarchy, right? That's why it's interesting to know. So like anti-government here means like you're really against like the kind of the civic ideology of the nation. You're against the president, right? You're against like the Congress, I guess. But in the UK, they have the Queen, and so being anti-government there means something completely different, right? Because the Queen, I mean, right now Queen Elizabeth II is the longest reigning monarch in history, but the English monarchy goes all the way back, to like the 500s or something like that. So it's it's quite something. It goes back like 1500 years. So that's a little bit different than us being, or than people in the U.S. being like, anti-government. So who are the top bands here? Well, we have Adam and the Ants, the Sex Pistols, and most importantly, though, we have The Clash. The Clash were one of the finest rock and roll bands to commandeer a stage. I think what is fair to say, where we can say that the Ramones in the U.S. were the inventors of punk. I might be okay to say that. I think it's fair to also say to give the Clash a lot of credit because they were far more musical than the Ramones were. Okay, they were better at their instruments. They were better overall songwriters, and yeah, so I think we could say that. Even here, I say that the band was led by guitarist Joe Strummer and Mick Jones, and sometimes those two are referred to as the Lennon and McCartney of the punk movement. Okay, so John Lennon and Paul McCartney, we know, are like one of the greatest songwriting duos in the history of popular music, and what Lennon and McCartney did for pop and rock and roll, um, Joe Strummer and Mick Jones did for punk. They were influenced strongly by reggae music and rockabilly. So if you remember guys like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, that's an example of rockabilly music. And then reggae, especially in the 1970s. Um, in the 1970s, well, two things happened. Number one, Jamaica got its independence from England as the old empire started to splinter around the world. But what ended up happening is that the 1970s saw a big influx of Jamaican immigrants into the UK. And as new immigrants often are, they were kind of outcast. And punk rock really is a music for outcasts. So they brought their own styles of music from Jamaica, like ska and reggae. And the punk rockers in the UK were all too happy to um, let their music let the Jamaican music influence their music and vice versa. So you'll hear a lot of the punk rock coming out of the UK does seem to have a reggae or ska influence. Their first three albums, the self-titled debut album, The Clash in 1977, Give 'Em Enough Rope in 1978, and then my personal favorite, 1979's London Calling, are really some of the best albums and best songs to come out of the punk rock era. And punk rock has influenced many bands today, in the 90s, through the current day. So bands that you might have heard of that are very influenced by punk rock include Green Day, Blink-182, The Offspring, Sonic Youth, Bad Religion, and AFI. And that is going to be it for today. All right, folks. So let's submit those notes, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you guys, by the way, for your submissions of the questions for Mike Miley. It's looking like we're going to do that first Friday in June. What is that, June 5th, I think? So, so make sure your calendars are clear. We're probably going to be doing it around noon. So make sure your calendars are clear around that time. If you have anything else at that time, let them know you're busy, okay? I haven't made anything mandatory since the lockdown, but this is definitely mandatory. So I'll be happy to talk to your teacher on your behalf if you need me to do that. All right, folks, have a great day, and I will see you next time.